So that I keep talking about files. So let's talk a little bit about file handling now. So far, up to this point in the Python training, we've only looked at storing our data temporarily in variables. And remember, in the principles of programming, we talked about how a variable is basically just a box that is stored in memory, and it's got a label on it which says it gives it a name which indicates the type of information it's storing, and there's a value inside. Um, but that only exists for as long as that particular session exists. So when you close down VS Code or shut down your computer or whatever, when you come back, those variables are gone. And that's the point of variables. They are just designed for the computer to remember something for the moment whilst it's running this piece of code. But we may also have inputs from the user or outputs that we will generate from our code that we need to store longer term, i.e. between sessions. So it might be things like if we're building models, we might need to have parameters for our model, and you could get the user to type in and input them each time, but that's not a great way to do it. So you might instead choose to read in parameters from a file. Now, actually, the better option, the best option, is when you come to module 7, and Sammy will talk to you about web app development using Streamlit, where you can develop a web app, and that's how you'll plug in your parameters. But before that, you may want to read in files, and you may even in a web app have a file. You might have hundreds or thousands of parameters for a particularly complex machine learning algorithm or something like that, and you want to the user to basically just change little bits of it. You don't want to have to imagine you have 100 parameters. You don't want the user to type in everything from scratch each time. Similarly, when you have outputs from your models, for example, your results, then you may want to store those so you've got reference to them later. You may need to report on them, for example. So there are lots of different ways in which we can work with files in Python, lots of different ways, and you'll see various different approaches throughout this course. Most of the time, though, for the kind of things you will be doing, modeling and data science, you will be likely interacting in some way with comma-separated value files, CSV files. I suspect many of you are aware of what CSV files are, but for those who aren't, CSV files are basically just text files that have discrete values that are separated by commas. And that makes it easy for them to be read into and exported from tables and spreadsheets. So you can, there's in Excel, if you're using Excel, you can export a spreadsheet as a CSV file. Similarly, you can read them in, although be careful about reading in CSV files in Excel, because it can do little formatting things that if you're not careful, you can accidentally corrupt your CSV file a little bit. So basically, we can think of a CSV file as being data that is separated into rows or records, i.e. each line, and columns where each column is separated by a comma. So here we've got an example here where we've got sort of names as the first entry before a comma, and then some sort of yes or no flag after is the second entry, and then perhaps that's an age as the third entry, and a county as the fourth entry. So, and then we've got each row basically represents maybe a different patient record. Now, there's a library within Python called CSV, which allows us to work with comma-separated value files really easily. It allows us to read and write them with ease. And actually, there's an even easier way to work with CSV files that is more appropriate for what you will be doing most of the time. And that's using a particular Pandas function, but we'll come back to that later. But you may not always be doing that, and so this is the non-Pandas approach, basically, of doing this. So let's say we wanted to read in a CSV file. This is our CSV file here. It's a very simple CSV file. It's basically just got sort of two columns. the first entry on each row is just a name and the second entry is an age. Okay, really simple CSV file. Then what we can do is we can read that in, and we could store the names in one list and the ages in a second list. And we can do that really easily using the CSV library. So first of all, I import the CSV library. It's called CSV. Then I'm just going to set up here two empty lists. I've called it one list of names and the other list of ages. So it's very clear what each one's going to store. And then we use this line of code here. Now, this is known as a with statement. So you'll see these quite often in Python. And throughout this course, you'll see with statements used a lot. Particularly, you'll see them used in a different way with SymPy, and we'll come back to that in Module 2. But basically, a with statement says, do all of this stuff in the block of code with this in hand. Okay, so what this is saying is, I want you to open the file called filename.csv. So that's the file name. And I want to open that in read-only mode. So that's the R. We'll come back to that. And I want you to cast that as an alias of f. Remember, we talked about aliases the week, was it last week or the week before, maybe both, where we said that when we import libraries, we can import them with an alias. And we basically just say, we use the word as, and then we give it a name. And basically what that means is, from this point forward, I'll just refer to it as this. And that's what this is saying. It's saying, open up this file with this file name and open it in read-only mode. And henceforth, I'm going to refer to that file that's been opened in read-only mode as f. Okay, so that's all the as f means. It's just an alias. But I'm going to do this with a with statement. So basically, do all of this with that file opened. Okay. Now, the advantage of doing it this way is that there are different ways to do it. You can do it without the with statement and just open the file. If you do it that way, you have to remember to close the file again after, because it will remain opened unless you close it. And if you don't close it, very weird things can happen. So it's far safer, and it's actually a more elegant approach to use a with statement. So basically, Python will do it automatically. It'll run this code with all of this. This is all the stuff you want done while that file is open in read-only mode. And as soon as it's finished, it will just automatically close it. So that's a better approach to use it. So with that file, that CSV file, open in read-only mode, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a reader object. We'll learn more about objects in Python next week. But remember, we talked a bit about object-oriented programming. So this creates an instance of the reader class, basically. So it creates a csv.reader, and we need to pass it, to create a reader object, we need to pass it two things. The file that we want it to read, which remember we're referring to as f, because we've set up this alias, and the delimiter, which in most cases is going to be comma for CSV, but you can have other delimited files. You can have semicolon delimited and other things. Depends on your file, but 99% of the time you'll be using delimiter equals comma. So create a reader object that's going to read this file, and it's delimited by commas. And then all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use a simple for loop. And I'm going to say for each row in the reader, because it'll go down row by row, line by line in our file, then I want to basically store the first value, i.e. the one that comes before the first comma, in our list of names, and the second value, i.e. the one that comes after the first comma and before the second comma, if there is one, in our list of ages. Okay, and we can refer to these by however we refer to this. So I usually just use the word row. Basically means the line. We can refer to them like a list element. So we can, if we say row 0, that means index 0. It means the first item before a comma. Row 1 means the second item. Row 2 would be the third item, etc. So if we run that piece of code, we'll end up with two lists. One will have a list of names, and the other will have a list of ages. So as well as reading CSV files with the CSV library, we can also write them, and it's equally easy to do that. So again, here I've imported the CSV library. I've set up a little list here which will represent my column titles, because I may want titles in my CSV. They don't always have them, but some do. This one's going to. And then I've set up a few lists that I want to set up. So basically, I want to write a CSV file that looks like this. That's got name and ID on the first row as the kind of headers, and then it'll have the name and ID for each entry. So we've got Dan, Sammy, and Amy and their respective IDs. So here I'm going to combine those things into a list of lists. So remember we talked about last week that a list can hold any object, including another list. So here we have a list that contains itself 3 lists. And then what I've done this just to make it easier to write the CSV file. So again, I'm going to use the with statement here. I'm going to open the file. This time I'm going to open it in write mode because I need to write the CSV file. So I use a W. Again, we'll come back to that. And I'm going to specify this new line parameter, and I'm going to open and close my inverted commas here. So I put in nothing, but I put in an empty character. Now, that you have to do if you're using Windows. We discovered this a couple of years ago. If you don't, you'll end up with a CSV with a blank line in between each entry, and it's an absolute nightmare. So if you don't have to do this if you're not using Windows, although it doesn't matter. You may as well do it because it'll still work. But if you're using Windows, this is absolutely essential, unless you genuinely do want a blank line in your between each entry in a CSV file, which I can't imagine you do. You have to enter this new line equals and then open and close inverted commas. So otherwise, this is the same as before. I'm going to use the alias of f for the opened file. And this time I'm going to create a writer object instead of a reader object. So I'll create a CSV writer. And again, I say this is the file, the opened file that I want to write. And this is the delimiter. It's going to be comma delimited. Again, most of the time that's what you'll use. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the CSV file line by line. Now, because mine has I want it to have column headers, I'm going to add this extra line of code here where I'm going to use the writer to write a row, and I'm going to write that list here, and it'll write it as 2 entries in a CSV file. So you can pass it any iterable object, like a list, and it will write out those entries as a line on a CSV file. Now, if you didn't have a header, column headers, then you could just ignore that bit. But I do, so I'm going to add that in. And then for the rest of it, I'm just going to loop through my list of lists. That's why I put all these lists in a list, so that I could just go through each list in my list of lists, and I'm going to tell it to write the row based on that list. Okay, so whenever you want to write a row of a CSV file using the CSV writer, you just pass it an iterable object like a list, and it will write that out. Each element of the list will then come out on that line.